Have you ever heard someone say, "I did everything for this person, and still they left me"? Or perhaps you have felt that no matter how hard you try, the other person never reciprocates in the same way. Most people believe they are in love when, in fact, they are emotionally indebted. And this difference is profound and dangerous. In the contemporary world, shaped by neoliberal values and a culture of emotional performance, many live in relationships where love has ceased to be a meeting and has turned into a contract. An invisible contract, of course, but cruel. Emotions have begun to operate within the logic of the market. Expectations of return, risk assessment, emotional investments, and at the center of it all, a silent emotional accounting that says, "If I do this for you, you will end up loving me back." But this reciprocity rarely happens, and what remains is the emptiness of an unpayable debt. This phenomenon is not just psychological, it is structural. According to sociologist Illouz, author of Cold Intimacies, we live today under a regime of affective capitalism, where feelings are captured by market dynamics. Just as consumers go into debt to achieve an ideal of success, the emotionally indebted individual sinks into sacrifices and renunciations in search of an ideal of love that never arrives. This is the new face of modern romantic suffering. Asymmetric relationships, where one gives without limits and the other merely benefits, without even realizing there is an imbalance. Worse, in many cases, those trapped in this debt do not even notice. They keep trying, yielding, planning futures with those who barely care about the present, not out of weakness, but because they have been taught that love must be earned. That effort will eventually be rewarded. But here is the truth. When love is transformed into an investment, it is already doomed. And the more you invest expecting a return, the further you distance yourself from the authentic experience of love, which is free, spontaneous, and mutual. This video is a call to awareness, a mirror for those who feel exhausted, used, emotionally bankrupt. The question we will explore is not, why doesn't the other person reciprocate? But rather, why do you still believe you need to pay to be loved? This is not just another video about how to save a relationship. It is about how to save yourself from the cruel logic that turns feelings into debts and people into creditors of affection. Throughout this video, we will dive into the anatomy of emotional debt, the mechanisms that sustain this vicious cycle, and most importantly, how to break it. Because no one should live in emotional deficit. If you have ever felt that you love more than you are loved, that you give and only receive silence, or that you are waiting for an emotional return that never comes, this video is for you. The emotionally indebted subject is not born ready, he is produced. Slowly shaped by a culture that mixes affection and market logic, he learns early on that to love is to earn it. That emotions must be measured, controlled, managed. And that, in the end, every feeling is a kind of investment. This way of thinking is not just personal, but social. It arises at the intersection of the values of neoliberal capitalism and affective intimacy. This is where what Illouz calls emotional capitalism is born. Over the last 50 years, Western society has undergone a silent but profound mutation. Feelings have ceased to be spaces of spontaneity and have become territories of performance. The business logic, based on effort, reward, productivity, and efficiency, has invaded the most intimate sphere of human existence, romantic life. Today, people are expected to know how to sell their personality well, manage emotional crises with maturity, invest in others consistently, and grow together as if the relationship were a startup. Within this scenario, love transforms into work. And even more, into a work that demands, requires, drains, but rarely pays back. The indebted subject is one who has internalized this logic. He believes that if he offers understanding, attention, sex, emotional stability, future planning, infinite patience, then at some point, he will be rewarded with love. He lives as if he were paying invisible installments of an effective financing, hoping for an emotional profit that never comes. This construction is not accidental. It is reinforced by self-help discourses, romantic movies, and even family advice. If you are good enough, he or she will change. Keep insisting. That is proof of love. Every relationship requires effort. The problem is that this mentality creates a perverse equation. The more one gives, the harder it is to accept that there is no return, because admitting this would mean facing the collapse of the belief that love can be earned through merit. This is the origin of the debt, a combination of the promise of future reward and the inability to recognize that perhaps it will never come. The indebted subject lives in a permanent state of emotional anticipation. He tries to guess what the other wants, adapts, nullifies himself, reorganizes, all to keep alive the project of reciprocated love. But this project is, most of the time, one-sided. And it is exactly about this that we will talk in the next part, when love ceases to be an exchange and becomes a loan. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Imagine a bank that continues to extend credit to a customer who never pays anything back. A bank that offers loans, tolerates emotional default, and even increases the limit, all without any guarantee of return. It seems absurd, but this is exactly how many people live their relationships. Love, which should be a meeting, becomes a unilateral concession, a continuous offer of affection, patience, care, and presence to someone who hasn't even asked for it, hasn't valued it, and certainly doesn't intend to reciprocate. The emotionally indebted person transforms in this process into a kind of affection banker. They offer everything: time, listening, forgiveness, emotional support, understanding of others' traumas, adaptation to silences, and even renunciation of their own desires. And all of this is given without guarantees. The unconscious belief is, the more I offer, the greater the chance that he or she will see my value and start to reciprocate. But this logic doesn't work, because love is not a credit relationship. When it starts to function this way, it is already broken. In this dynamic, the defaulting partner is not always a villain in the classic sense. They may just be someone who has never shown real interest, but realizes they receive a lot and give little. Someone who has become accustomed to being loved effortlessly, desired without reciprocity, forgiven without change. For them, the relationship is convenient, but never a commitment. Meanwhile, the indebted person sinks deeper, because the more they give without return, the greater the feeling of debt. I've given so much that I can't stop now. It's the trap of emotional banking logic. Worse, often this pattern becomes normalized. The person believes they are just being understanding, emotionally maturing, or doing what anyone would do for love. But the truth is, they are mortgaging their emotional health. They confuse resilience with submission. And deep down, there is a secret accounting. Each gesture is recorded as credit, a difficult conversation tolerated, a jealousy ignored, an absence forgiven. Everything noted in the hope that, one day, the other will make a big deposit back. But this deposit rarely comes, and if it does, it never covers what was given. This is the point where love ceases to be a bond and becomes a debt, where the relationship is sustained not by exchange, but by hope. And it is at this exact point that the silent collapse of subjectivity begins, the feeling of paying for something that was never truly delivered. In the next part, we will dive even deeper into this illusion. We will understand why so many people continue to invest in failed relationships, obsessively believing that the emotional return is just around the corner, when, in fact, it never was. The idea that love will be rewarded over time is one of the most destructive illusions of modern emotional life. Fueled by romantic narratives, movies, songs, and even well-intentioned advice, this belief seduces with the promise of emotional justice. If I am good enough, if I can endure a little longer, if I give more, the other will notice and will love me back. But this logic is a trap. Because genuine love does not arise from effort, it arises from connection. And connection cannot be manufactured, bought, and above all, cannot be demanded. The indebted person lives in the shadow of this illusion. They carry the weight of a hope that never materializes, but which prevents them from leaving the relationship. After all, leaving would mean admitting that everything invested, time, patience, sacrifices, was in vain. And that is a pain that many people cannot bear, so they prefer to continue. They prefer to increase the debt, renegotiate their own limits, recalculate their expectations. They pretend they are building something, when in fact they are just emotionally surviving a bond that no longer sustains them. This is the logic of the hope for return, an expectation shaped by a system that has taught us that everything can be achieved through effort, that it is enough to persist to get what one desires. But in the realm of affection, this simply is not true. Love is not a consolation prize for those who have endured more pain. It is not a reward for being loyal, patient, or understanding. Love does not respond to the logic of merit. It responds to the logic of presence. Either there is exchange, or there is no bond. Everything else is fantasy. And this fantasy is cruel because it makes the person complicit in their own suffering. They interpret disdain as distraction, coldness as unresolved trauma, indifference as fear of loving. Everything is rationalized to protect the illusion that it can still work out. And thus, they distance themselves from reality. They become disconnected from themselves, from their own feelings, needs, and limits. Because admitting that the other will not change, that they will not reciprocate, that they never truly wanted the same, that would be the end of hope. And without hope, what remains? But it is precisely here that the key lies, because it is in breaking this illusion that the process of liberation begins. It is by facing the absence of reciprocity without masks that the indebted person begins to realize they are trapped in a debt that was never theirs, that they are paying interest on a love that was never promised. And it is about this prison that we will talk in the next part, the trauma of emotional debt, and how it deeply infiltrates the identity of those who always live, hoping for a return that never comes. Emotional indebtedness is not just a temporary state of romantic frustration. It is a continuous psychological trauma, a corrosive process that wears down identity, undermines self-esteem, and deeply recalibrates how a person sees themselves and relates to others. The emotionally indebted individual not only feels unloved, they begin to believe they are unworthy of love unless they continue to sacrifice themselves. This distortion is so profound that pain ceases to be seen as a symptom and becomes confused with love itself. This is where the trauma settles, because over time, this individual learns to associate affection with effort, attention with performance, and connection with suffering. They normalize abandonment, relativize coldness, and idealize the indifference of others as a puzzle to be solved, rather than as evidence of a lack of reciprocity. And so they cling to relationships that hurt them, believing that each new disappointment is just another step toward final recognition. Love becomes a waiting game, an endless wait, an eternal not yet, almost there, just a little more. The consequences are devastating. Constant anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, fear of rejection, depersonalization. The person begins to live for the other, regulating their emotions based on crumbs of attention. Every responded message becomes relief. Every silence becomes anguish. Every small gesture is overvalued as a sign of hope, when in reality it is just the bare minimum, and sometimes not even that. The mind enters a state of chronic vigilance, trying to anticipate reactions, avoiding conflicts, suppressing desires. This is what Illouz calls emotional performativity, a way of existing solely to maintain the affection of the other, even at the cost of oneself. This type of trauma is insidious because it does not come with explicit violence. On the contrary, it operates in relationships that on the surface seem civilized, difficult but possible, full of nuances. But inside, they are environments of psychic exhaustion. The person remains silent to avoid bothering others. They give in to avoid being abandoned. And they silence their pain to preserve a relationship that only exists at the cost of their own emotional integrity. The trauma of affective debt is not a sudden collapse. It is the slow and constant erosion of everything the person once was. And the longer this dynamic lasts, the harder it becomes to escape it. Because the indebted individual does not just want love, they want to justify all the suffering they have endured. They want to prove that it was worth it, that it all had a purpose, that they were enough. But this validation never comes, and while they wait, they disconnect from who they were before. They lose their sense of worthiness, desire, and power. They become merely an extension of someone else's desire. But there is a way out. And it begins with a simple yet painful act, recognizing that this debt is not yours, that you are trapped in a structure that never aimed to reciprocate. In the next part, we will dismantle this structure and understand how to break the cycle, why true love never operates on the logic of continuous effort, and what it truly means to love without functioning as an emotional line of credit. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There comes a moment when the emotionally indebted individual must confront the most uncomfortable truth. The love they sought never existed in the way they imagined. What existed was a projection fueled by neediness, idealization, and, above all, by an emotional system built on the logic of merit. A system that convinced them that the more they gave, the closer they would be to receiving. But love is not a bargain. Love is not a reward. Love is not a debt that will one day be settled with a saving gesture. Real love is flow, not demand. It is exchange, not expectation. It is encounter, not investment. Breaking this cycle requires a deep internal reconfiguration. It means recognizing that unilateral giving is not a virtue. It is self-sabotage. That insisting on someone who does not reciprocate is not resilience. It is a denial of one's own dignity. That eternally adapting to the other is, at its core, a disguised way of abandoning oneself. And that the affection you try to earn through effort is, by definition, incompatible with the genuine experience of loving and being loved. Illouz, in dissecting the logic of effective capitalism, shows us that this model of relationship is intrinsically linked to a culture of performance. We are surrounded by narratives that say, everything is a matter of doing better, communicate better, be more patient, understand the other more, don't demand so much, give in more. But what these narratives hide is that, in many cases, there is no imbalance to be corrected. There is a lack of reciprocity, and there is no technique that can transform disinterest into love. What exists is a choice: to continue paying an emotional debt that was never acknowledged, or to break with this logic and choose another path. Breaking is not giving up on love. It is refusing a model of relationship based on scarcity. It is understanding that loving is not becoming emotionally indebted in the name of a promise that never came. It is stopping the justification of the other's disinterest with therapeutic discourses, spiritual rationalizations, or self-help cliches. Love does not need to be explained. It is felt, perceived, lived. And if you constantly need to convince yourself that it exists, it is probably not there. And there is something even more important. The individual who breaks this cycle is not just leaving a toxic relationship. They are reconstructing their identity outside the logic of debt and credit. They are learning that their worth does not depend on others' approval, that their giving needs to find return, and that their capacity to love can no longer be wasted on emotional voids. But for this reconstruction to be possible, a decisive step must be taken. To clearly identify the role one has assumed within the relational dynamic, one must ask themselves with brutal honesty, are you loving or are you functioning as an emotional bank? This is exactly what we will discuss in the next and final part, the way out of emotional bankruptcy, the recovery of emotional autonomy, and the construction of authentic bonds based on real exchange and not on empty promises. Recognizing that you are not in love, but rather emotionally indebted, is one of the most difficult and liberating acts of the psychic life. Because at that moment, you realize that you were not seeking love. You were desperately trying to balance an emotional accounting that only existed in your head. The other person owes you nothing. And more importantly, you no longer owe them anything either. This is the breaking point. It is when the cycle of debt can finally be closed. But only if you have the courage to step out of the role of emotional banker and return to being just what you always should have been. Someone willing to love, yes, but only if there is true reciprocity. Emotional bankruptcy occurs when the soul exhausts itself trying to sustain what no longer has a foundation. You no longer feel joy, but you insist. You no longer recognize yourself, but you continue. You no longer receive the minimum, but you still give yourself. And all of this is sustained by the illusion that there is an implicit contract between you and the other, as if, having invested too much, it is too late to give up. But the truth is harsh. The more you insist, the deeper you sink. The only way to get out of emotional debt is to accept the loss, absorb the mourning of what never was, and stop depositing love where there is no more emotional credit. Exiting this logic requires strength, but not a performative strength of immediate overcoming or blind resilience. It requires the strength of self-knowledge. It requires you to look at yourself honestly and ask, what am I trying to buy with this love? Acceptance, validation, security, and even more, why did I believe I would only be worthy of these things if I sacrificed myself first? These questions hurt, but it is they that liberate. Authentic love is not sustained by debt, constant sacrifice, or long-term emotional planning as if it were a high-risk investment. Real love is light, even when it requires effort. It does not pressure, does not exhaust, does not demand a pledge of your identity. It happens in the flow, in the exchange, in the natural gesture. And if you need to constantly transform yourself to be accepted, then it is not love. It is emotional bargaining. And bargaining is not a bond. It is disguised emotional survival. The way out of emotional bankruptcy begins with a symbolic act, closing the account, stopping to record every gesture, every silence, every frustration, stopping trying to predict what the other desires to continue being useful. Stopping trying to become someone the other can finally love. Because if love only comes after you destroy yourself, it is not worth it. You are not here to be anyone's emotional ATM. You are not here to function as a sentimental loan with exorbitant interest rates of guilt and fear. You are here to live relationships where love is natural, reciprocal, true, and not a debt that never ends. If this video made you reflect, comment below. Have you ever lived an emotional debt? Write your story, even if it is in one sentence. Someone may read it and recognize themselves, and that is already a beginning of healing. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. It is also important, perhaps more than you imagine.